I was holding a glass of champagne in the kitchen of the house I had just closed on 3 weeks earlier, laughing with my best friend about paint swatches, when I heard 4 suitcase wheels rolling across my new hardwood floor. Not one suitcase.
4.
Followed by 2 duffel bags and a rolling garment rack still wrapped in plastic. My husband's parents walked through my front door like they were checking into a hotel, and before I could even ask why they'd packed for a stay, my father-in-law set his suitcase down in my living room, looked around at the home I had spent 11 years saving for, and said 5 words that would end my marriage before the night was over. "We live here now, sweetheart." I laughed. I actually laughed because I thought it was a joke. It was not a joke. And what I found out over the next 6 weeks would make me question every single year I had spent loving a man who let his family walk into my life and try to take it from me. Stay with me, because this story does not end the way you think it will. If it resonates, hit subscribe, drop a like, and share it with someone who's ever had to fight for a home they built with their own 2 hands. My name is Reese Calloway, and for most of my adult life, I believed that if you worked hard enough, saved carefully enough, and loved honestly enough, the people around you would treat you the same way in return. I was a structural engineer in Charlotte, North Carolina, and I had spent over a decade in a career that demanded precision, patience, and an almost obsessive attention to detail. I liked it that way. Buildings don't lie to you. Blueprints don't smile at your face and stab you in the back later. Numbers either hold weight or they don't. I met my husband, Callum Bristow, when I was 26 at a mutual friend's birthday dinner. He was funny in a self-deprecating way, easy to talk to, and he asked more questions about my work than most people ever bothered to. We dated for 3 years before we got married in a small ceremony that I paid for almost entirely myself because Callum had just started a new sales job and didn't have much saved yet.
I didn't mind.
I told myself that's what partnership meant, that you carry each other when one person is ahead and the other is catching up. For the first several years of our marriage, that seemed true. We lived in a modest 2-bedroom apartment, and I put almost every spare dollar into a house fund. Callum's parents, Douglas and Priscilla Bristow, lived about 40 minutes away, and they visited often. At first, I liked them. Douglas was loud and told long stories about his years running a hardware store. Priscilla was the kind of woman who brought a casserole to every gathering whether you asked for one or not. But over time, I noticed a pattern that unsettled me. Douglas made comments about how a family house should have room for everyone. Priscilla asked, more than once, when Callum and I were going to buy something big enough for all of us to enjoy together. I brushed it off as old-fashioned thinking. I never imagined it was a plan. There was one dinner about 4 years into our marriage that I still think back on. Douglas had a few drinks and started talking about his own childhood, how 3 generations had once shared a single farmhouse in Ohio, how nobody in his family had ever needed a lease or a legal agreement to know they had a place to sleep. He looked at Callum when he said it, not at me, and said, "That's the kind of family I want us to be again someday." I remember smiling politely and changing the subject because at the time it felt like nostalgia, not a blueprint. Looking back, I think it was both. I also noticed, without fully processing it, how differently Callum behaved around his parents compared to how he behaved with me. Around me, he made his own decisions, voiced his own opinions, pushed back when he disagreed. Around Douglas, he went quiet and agreeable, nodding along to plans he hadn't been part of forming. I used to tell myself that was just how some men behaved around their fathers, a kind of old habit from childhood that didn't mean anything deeper. I didn't yet understand that the version of Callum who deferred to his father in small moments was the same version of Callum who would one day defer to him in the biggest moment of our marriage. 3 years ago, Callum's younger brother, Foster, lost his job and moved back in with Douglas and Priscilla. What was supposed to be temporary stretched into an open-ended arrangement. Foster didn't pay rent. He didn't look particularly hard for new work either. Whenever I asked Callum about it, he'd shrug and say, "That's just how my family does things. We take care of each other." I told myself that was admirable, even as something quiet in my chest tightened every time I heard it. What I didn't know at the time, and wouldn't learn until much later, was that Foster hadn't actually lost his job the way Callum had described it to me. He had been let go for repeatedly missing shifts, and instead of looking for new work, he had spent almost 2 years treating his parents' spare room as a permanent arrangement, one Douglas quietly resented but never challenged because Priscilla insisted that he just needs a little more time to find his footing. A little more time had become 3 years by the point Douglas lost the store, and somewhere in that stretch, Foster had stopped even pretending he was searching for anything at all. He had simply gotten comfortable being taken care of, and when his parents' house went into foreclosure, he didn't panic about his own future. He waited to see whose house would become the next place he didn't have to pay for. Then, 18 months ago, Douglas lost his hardware store. The building had been sold out from under him, the lease wasn't renewed, and at 61 years old, he found himself with no income and a mortgage he could no longer easily cover. I felt for him. I truly did. I helped Callum put together a folder of financial resources, refinancing options, and small business grants Douglas might qualify for. What I didn't know was that Callum had stopped looking at those resources almost immediately because somewhere in the months that followed, a different plan had already started forming in his family's minds, one that didn't involve refinancing anything. It involved me. I kept saving. I picked up overtime hours reviewing structural reports for a firm that paid well for weekend work. I skipped vacations 2 years in a row. I drove the same car for 9 years. And finally, after 11 years of budgeting, sacrificing, and refusing to touch a cent of that fund even during hard months, I had enough for a serious down payment on a house. Not a mansion. A beautiful 3-bedroom craftsman-style home outside Charlotte, with a wraparound porch and a garden bed I had already mentally filled with tomatoes and hydrangeas. The mortgage was in my name and Callum's name jointly, but the down payment, every cent of it, came from an account I had built alone, long before we were even engaged. The day we closed on the house, I cried in the parking lot of the title company. Not because I was sad. Because for the first time in my life, I felt like the ground beneath me was mine. I remember turning to Callum and saying, "We did it." He smiled and said, "You did it," in a tone I should have paid more attention to. I didn't. I was too happy. We planned a housewarming party for 3 weeks later, once the movers had finished and the boxes were mostly unpacked. I invited my closest friends, a few coworkers, my sister, and of course, Callum's parents and brother. I wanted it to be a celebration of everything I had worked for. I never once imagined it would become the night my marriage started to unravel in front of 22 guests holding paper plates of appetizers. The morning of the party, I noticed Callum seemed distracted. He kept checking his phone and stepping outside to take calls he didn't explain. I asked if everything was all right, and he said his dad was dealing with some stuff and might be running a little late. I didn't think much of it. Douglas was always running late. By 6 o'clock, the house was full of laughter, string lights glowing along the porch, and the smell of the lasagna my sister had made cooling on the counter. Around 7:15, headlights swept across the front windows, and a large SUV pulled into my driveway, followed almost immediately by a second car. I remember thinking, that's a lot of people for one family to bring to a housewarming. The front door opened before anyone even knocked. Douglas walked in first, holding 2 suitcases. Behind him came Priscilla, wheeling a 3rd suitcase and carrying a box of framed photographs I recognized from their old living room wall. Then came Foster, dragging a 4th suitcase and a duffel bag, followed by a mover from a rental truck outside, rolling in a garment rack still wrapped in plastic from a closet somewhere else entirely. The room went quiet. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Someone's fork paused halfway to their mouth. I stood there, genuinely confused, waiting for someone to explain the joke. Douglas set his suitcase down in the middle of my new living room, looked around at the space like he was inspecting a property he already owned, and said the words that would replay in my head for weeks afterward. "We live here now, sweetheart." Callum explained everything. "There's plenty of room." I laughed, because my brain refused to accept what I had just heard. I turned to Callum, expecting him to laugh too, to say something like, "Dad, you're joking, right?" Instead, Callum wouldn't meet my eyes. He rubbed the back of his neck and said quietly, "Reese, can we talk in the kitchen for a second?" That single sentence told me everything I needed to know, and none of what I actually wanted to know. In the kitchen, away from the guests who were now whispering behind us, Callum finally spoke. He told me that his father's house had gone into foreclosure 2 weeks earlier, faster than anyone expected, and that Douglas and Priscilla had nowhere to go. Foster, of course, had nowhere to go either, because he'd never left in the first place. Callum said he had been meaning to talk to me about it, but kept putting it off because he didn't want to ruin the housewarming. I asked him the only question that mattered in that moment. Did you tell them they could move in here? Into my house. He hesitated, then said, It's our house, Reese. And it's just temporary. A few months, tops. I felt the floor tilt beneath me, the same floor I had spent 11 years earning the right to stand on. I walked back into the living room, where Douglas had already started directing Foster on where to put the suitcases, as if he were assigning bedrooms in a house he'd never once helped pay for. I asked him, as calmly as I could manage in front of 22 stunned guests, to please explain what was happening. Douglas looked at me like I was the one being unreasonable. Family helps family, he said. Callum said there's more than enough space here for everyone. We already gave notice on storage for our furniture. It's done. It's done. 2 words that told me this had never been a request. It had been a decision made about my home without me. Asked Priscilla directly if she had discussed this with me at any point. She avoided the question entirely and instead said, We didn't want to make a big deal out of it. Families shouldn't need an invitation. I remember my hands shaking as I set my champagne glass down on the counter, because for the first time in 11 years of marriage, I understood that my husband had made a decision this large, this permanent, without saying a single word to me until his family was already standing in my living room with their bags packed. The guests began quietly leaving, murmuring apologies and excuses, clearly uncomfortable witnessing what was unfolding. My sister stayed behind, standing beside me with her arms crossed, watching Foster carry his duffel bag down the hallway toward the guest bedroom I had spent a full weekend painting a soft sage green. Asked him to stop. He looked at Callum, not me, for permission to keep going. That was the moment I realized this wasn't really about foreclosure or emergency housing. It was about who they believed had the final say in my own house. And it clearly wasn't me. I told everyone, as steadily as I could, that no one would be unpacking anything that night. Douglas scoffed and said I was being dramatic and that surely I wouldn't turn out an elderly man with nowhere else to go. I told him I was sorry about the foreclosure, genuinely sorry, but that this was a conversation that should have happened weeks ago, not an ambush disguised as a housewarming gift. Priscilla's face hardened. She said something I will never forget. You always acted like family didn't matter to you, as much as your career did. Now we see it clearly. I looked at Callum, waiting for him to defend me, to say something, anything, that acknowledged how wrong this entire evening had gone. Instead, he stood in the doorway with his arms crossed, staring at the floor, saying nothing at all. His silence was its own answer. That night, after his family had reluctantly agreed to stay at a nearby motel, just for now, I sat across from Callum at the kitchen table and asked him calmly how long he had been planning this, without telling me. He admitted it had been almost 3 weeks, the entire time we had been unpacking boxes and hanging pictures, the entire time I had been excitedly planning a housewarming party to celebrate something I thought was finally, fully mine. He said he didn't tell me because he knew how I'd react. I asked him if he understood that not telling me wasn't protecting me from a hard conversation. It was making the decision for me, alone, about a home I had paid for with 11 years of my own sacrifice. He didn't apologize that night. He justified. He told me his family had always done things this way, that when someone needed help, everyone pitched in, no questions asked, and that I was being cold for wanting boundaries around a house that legally had his name on it too. I reminded him, quietly, that his name being on the deed did not erase whose money had built the down payment, and it certainly didn't give him the right to invite 3 additional adults to move in without discussing it with me first. I barely slept that night. And the next morning, something happened that turned confusion into something far more serious. I went to check my email before work and found a message from my mortgage lender flagging unusual activity on our joint homeowners insurance policy. Someone had called the previous week requesting to add 3 additional named residents to the policy, along with a request to increase coverage limits due to additional household members and belongings. The request had been submitted using Callum's login credentials, but the callback number listed wasn't his. It was Douglas's. My stomach dropped as I sat there staring at the screen, because that meant this hadn't started the week of the party. This had started before I even knew guests were coming. Someone had been quietly restructuring my insurance policy to accommodate 3 new full-time residents before I had any say in the matter at all. I called the insurance company directly and asked them to explain exactly what had been requested and by whom. The representative confirmed that a man identifying himself as the homeowner's father had called 11 days earlier, providing enough personal information about the property, including the exact square footage and number of bedrooms, to convince the agent he had authorization to make changes. The agent noted that because he wasn't listed on the policy, the request had been placed under review pending verification, which was the only reason nothing had gone through yet. 11 days earlier. That was 4 days before the housewarming invitations had even gone out. Douglas hadn't reacted to a sudden emergency. He had been planning this quietly, methodically, treating my home like an inevitability he was simply finalizing the paperwork for. I confronted Callum with this information that evening, and for the first time, I watched something flicker across his face that looked almost like guilt, quickly replaced by defensiveness. He admitted his father had asked him for our account information nearly 2 weeks earlier to get some things sorted out in case the foreclosure moved faster than expected. He said he saw no harm in it because it was just insurance stuff. I asked him the question that had been building in me since the moment those suitcases rolled across my floor. Did you know, this whole time, that your parents were planning to move in permanently, not temporarily? He was quiet for a long moment before he finally admitted the truth. Foster had lost his lease on a separate apartment months earlier and had quietly been counting on Douglas and Priscilla's house as a long-term arrangement. When that house went into foreclosure, the plans simply shifted target from an inherited family home to the newly purchased one, mine, because in Callum's family's mind, family homes belonged to whoever needed them most, not necessarily to whoever paid for them. That single sentence rearranged everything I thought I understood about my marriage. I wasn't looking at an emergency. I was looking at a belief system, one where my sacrifice and my labor. Over the following days, I discovered more. I found a text thread on our shared family calendar app, an app one had installed years earlier, so we could coordinate schedules, showing that Callum had added Mom and Dad plus Foster moving weekend as an event 3 weeks before the housewarming, using a calendar color I had never noticed before because I rarely opened that particular tab. It had been sitting there, visible the entire time, hidden in plain sight because I trusted him enough not to go digging through shared apps for secrets. I also found a message from Priscilla to Callum, sent 9 days before the party, that read, "Tell Reese it's temporary at first. She'll come around once she sees how much easier life is with everyone together." That single message told me they hadn't just planned to move in without asking. They had planned exactly how to manage my reaction once I found out, treating my consent as an obstacle to be softened, not a decision to be respected. I sat with that message for a long time. Then I did something I hadn't expected to do so early in all of this. I called a real estate attorney. The attorney I spoke with, a calm, direct woman named Adeline Voss, walked me through exactly what my rights were regarding the property, my finances, and the down payment I had made independently before marriage assets were commingled. She explained that while Callum's name being on the deed gave him legal ownership rights, it did not obligate me to accept additional residents I hadn't consented to, and that if the situation escalated into anything resembling coercion, harassment, or an attempt to establish residency claims through utility bills or mail forwarding, I needed documented proof of the timeline as early as possible. That warning turned out to be more important than I realized, because 4 days later, I came home from work to find that Douglas had used the guest bedroom address to redirect his mail. A single piece of forwarded correspondence sat on my kitchen counter, addressed to Douglas Bristow, at my address, dated 2 days after the housewarming party, meaning the mail forwarding request had been submitted the very same week his family showed up with suitcases, not after some emergency discussion about temporary housing, but as part of an already moving plan to establish permanent residency in a house I owned. I photographed the envelope. I saved every email. I printed the insurance request records. I documented the calendar entry with a timestamp. Adeline had told me that people who believe they're entitled to something rarely expect to be questioned, which is exactly why they often leave a trail without realizing it. When I confronted Callum with the mail forwarding, something in him finally cracked, not into honesty, but into anger. He accused me of building a case against his own family, of treating a housing crisis like a crime scene. I told him, as steadily as I could manage, that I wasn't the one who had turned my own home into evidence. I was simply the one who had finally opened my eyes to what was happening inside it. 2 days after that argument, I came home to find the locks on the back door had been rekeyed. Not by me, not by a locksmith I had hired. I stood on my own back porch, key in hand, unable to get into my own kitchen, until I called the emergency locksmith line and had them come cut through the new hardware entirely. When the locksmith checked the invoice history on the smart lock system, he found a service request placed under Douglas's name 3 days earlier, requesting a full rekey for the new residence. The technician who had done the original work told me, almost apologetically, that Douglas had shown him a copy of the deed with Callum's name on it and claimed to be acting on the homeowner's behalf. Nobody had thought to call and confirm with me because on paper, it looked like a normal request from a normal family member helping out with the move. That was the moment the fear crept in, quiet and cold, underneath the anger. If they could rekey my house without my knowledge, what else had they already quietly arranged that I hadn't discovered yet? I called Adeline that same night, and for the first time, she used a word I hadn't expected to hear in a conversation about my own in-laws. She said, calmly, that what I was describing had crossed from a family disagreement into a pattern that could reasonably be classified as an attempt to establish unauthorized control over a property, and that I needed to change every access point to that house immediately and document every single change with timestamp photos and receipts. I spent that entire weekend swapping locks, resetting the garage code, changing the Wi-Fi-connected security cameras to an account only I had access to, and reviewing 2 weeks of camera footage I hadn't thought to check before. Buried in that footage, from 8 days before the housewarming, was a clip of Douglas standing on my front porch alone, in the middle of a weekday afternoon while Callum and I were both at work, measuring the width of the front doorway with a tape measure, presumably for furniture.
He had a key.
I never gave him one. Callum had. I sat with that footage for a long time, watching my father-in-law walk the length of my porch, unbothered, unhurried, like a man surveying property he already considered half his. There was no panic in his movements, no urgency of someone facing an emergency eviction. He moved like someone finalizing measurements for a move he had already decided was happening, regardless of what conversations hadn't taken place yet. I replayed the clip 3 times, searching for some detail that might soften what I was seeing, some sign that this had been a spontaneous visit rather than a calculated one. There wasn't one. He had brought his own tape measure. That night, Douglas and Priscilla returned, uninvited, expecting to move their remaining boxes in from the motel. I met them at the front door before they could bring anything inside. I told them, calmly but firmly, that they were not moving into my house, that the housewarming had never been an agreement to house 3 additional adults, and that any further attempt to establish residency without my consent would be treated as a legal matter, not a family disagreement. Douglas's expression shifted from confusion to fury in seconds. He told me I was turning my back on family in their darkest hour. Priscilla accused me of caring more about square footage than the people who raised the man I married. Foster, standing behind them holding a single duffel bag, said nothing at all, which somehow felt like its own kind of confession. I looked past all 3 of them, directly at Callum, who stood frozen in the doorway between the porch and the living room, caught between the family he had spent his entire life deferring to and the wife he had spent 11 years allowing to build something alone. I asked him one final question, in front of all of them. Did you ever, even once, Plan to ask me before deciding who gets to live in my home? He didn't answer, and in the silence that followed, I understood that the answer had been no from the very beginning. Douglas's face went red, and for a moment, I thought he might actually raise his voice loud enough for the neighbors to hear. Instead, he did something colder. He looked at me and said, "You've always thought you were better than this family because you make more money. This is exactly what I expected from you." Priscilla nodded along beside him, arms crossed, as if his words had simply confirmed something they discussed privately for years. I realized, standing there in my own doorway, that this had never been about foreclosure or emergencies at all. It had been about a belief, quietly held for over a decade, that because I earned more and saved more, my resources existed to be distributed however the family decided, without my input, without my consent, and without so much as a conversation beforehand. I told them, in the calmest voice I could manage, that this conversation was over, that they were welcome to collect any belongings from the porch, and that anything left inside my home after that night would be treated as abandoned property. Foster finally spoke for the first time all evening, muttering that I was acting like a landlord instead of family. I told him that landlords, at the very least, ask you to sign a lease before moving in. Family, apparently, in his experience, didn't need to ask at all. They left that night, but not quietly. Priscilla called me twice over the following week, each time escalating from tearful pleading to outright accusations that I was destroying a marriage over a few suitcases. I stopped answering after the second call. Adeline had warned me that continuing to engage verbally, without documentation, only gave them more opportunities to reframe the story later, so I let every future contact go through her office instead. Over the next 2 weeks, the legal situation moved quickly. Adeline helped me file a formal notice establishing that Douglas, Priscilla, and Foster had no legal residency claim to the property, and that any further attempt to forward mail, transfer utilities, or establish an address at the home would be treated as trespass and potential fraud, given the documented insurance request made without my authorization. The insurance company, upon reviewing the timeline I provided, flagged the original request as unauthorized and permanently blocked it from being resubmitted without my direct verification. Callum, faced with the reality that his family's plan had legally collapsed, finally seemed to understand the weight of what he had done. He apologized, but it came far too late, and it came with the same justification wrapped around it that his family had used from the start. "I thought I was helping everyone. I thought you'd understand eventually." I told him that understanding wasn't the problem. Being asked would have been the difference between partnership and betrayal, and he had chosen the second one, quietly, over and over, for weeks, while I hung curtains and planted hydrangeas in a garden I believed was finally safely mine. I moved out of our shared bedroom that week, though I stayed in the house, because Adeline had made it clear that leaving the property voluntarily during an active dispute could complicate my claim to it later. Those were some of the loneliest nights of my life, sleeping in my own guest room, in a house I had sacrificed 11 years to earn, while the man I married slept down the hall, having chosen his family's comfort over my consent without a second thought. Word eventually spread through Callum's extended family about what had happened, and the reaction surprised me. Not everyone sided with Douglas and Priscilla. Callum's aunt, a woman named Marguerite, who had always kept a respectful distance from family drama, reached out to tell me she had watched this pattern play out once before, years earlier, with a cousin whose apartment had quietly become temporary family housing for over 3 years. She said she had stayed quiet back then, and she regretted it, because staying quiet had only ever taught Douglas that boundaries were suggestions, not requirements. Hearing that confirmed something I had already started to suspect. This wasn't a one-time emergency. It was a pattern the family had used before, and Callum, whether consciously or not, had been raised to see it as normal. Marguerite told me something else that stayed with me for a long time. She said that in Douglas's mind, generosity only ever flowed one direction, toward him and toward whichever of his sons needed rescuing that year, and that anyone who questioned that flow was labeled selfish, cold, or ungrateful, regardless of how much they had already given. She said she had watched Callum grow up learning that lesson from the time he was a teenager, watching his father quietly redirect family resources toward whoever's crisis was loudest at the moment, and that some sons grow up rejecting that pattern entirely, while others grow up believing it's simply what love looks like. Callum, she said gently, had never learned any other definition. I didn't feel triumphant hearing that. I felt a strange, hollow kind of sadness, because it meant Callum hadn't necessarily set out to betray me the way a stranger might have. He had simply never developed the instinct to ask, because in his family, asking had never been part of how decisions were made. That didn't excuse what happened. It didn't undo the suitcases, or the mail forwarding, or the rekeyed locks. But it helped me understand that some betrayals aren't born from malice. They're born from a person never once being taught that other people's boundaries deserve the same respect as their own family's comfort. The divorce filing came 6 weeks after the housewarming party, faster than either of us expected, because once the legal groundwork around the property was clear, there was very little left worth staying for. Callum did not contest the house. Adeline had built too clean a paper trail showing the down payment had come from funds I owned independently before the marriage, and Callum, to his credit in that one moment, seemed to understand that fighting me on it publicly would only expose exactly how the entire situation had unfolded, insurance fraud attempt included. Douglas, on the other hand, did not go quietly. Once he realized the house was permanently out of reach, he tried a different approach, calling the insurance company himself and attempting to claim that he had verbal permission from the homeowner to be added to the policy, hoping to retroactively legitimize the earlier request. The agent, already flagged to treat any call from that number with caution, asked him to provide written authorization from either name listed on the deed. He couldn't. Adeline later told me that this single recorded call, in which Douglas repeated his claim of permission 3 separate times without ever being able to produce it, became one of the strongest pieces of evidence in establishing that his actions had been deliberate rather than a confused, well-meaning mistake made in a moment of crisis. There was a brief period, about a month into the process, when Priscilla tried a softer approach. She sent me a long, handwritten letter, delivered to my office rather than my home, apologizing for how everything had unfolded and asking if we could start fresh, just the two of us, without the house being part of it. I read it twice. Then I noticed that nowhere in 3 full pages did she ever actually say the words "I'm sorry for moving in without asking you." She apologized for how I felt. She apologized for the stress. She never once apologized for the decision itself. I didn't respond because I had learned, painfully, that an apology which never names the actual wrongdoing isn't an apology at all. It's a request for the consequences to end. By the time the settlement was finalized, 3 months after that first night with the suitcases, I had learned more about my own capacity for calm under pressure than I ever had in a decade of engineering reviews. The final walkthrough of the settlement happened on a quiet Tuesday afternoon. Callum came to collect the last of his belongings, and for a moment, standing in the living room where his father had once set down a suitcase and declared ownership over a life he had no part in building, Callum looked around at the space and said quietly, "I really did think it would all work out." I told him that hope isn't a plan, and silence isn't protection, and that somewhere along the way, he had confused loyalty to his family with honesty toward his wife, and only one of those could have saved his marriage. He left without saying anything else. In the months that followed, I focused on rebuilding, not out of anger, but out of a need to remember who I was before suitcases rolled across my floor and a stranger's voice told me I no longer had a say in my own home. I repainted the guest bedroom a warm ochre instead of sage green, because I wanted the space to feel entirely new. I finally planted the tomatoes and hydrangeas I had promised myself the day we closed on the house. I hosted a small dinner with my sister and 2 close friends, no suitcases, no ambushes, just quiet laughter around a table in a home that finally, truly, belonged only to me. At work, I was offered the lead engineer position on a major infrastructure project I had been quietly hoping for years. My supervisor told me she had always admired how calmly I handled pressure, how I never let chaos rush me into decisions I hadn't fully thought through. I realized, hearing that the same instincts that had made me good at my job, patience, documentation, refusing to be pressured into premature conclusions, were exactly what had protected me when my own home had been quietly targeted by people who assumed I would simply absorb the disruption without question. Months later, I met someone entirely by accident at a community fundraiser for affordable housing initiatives that Adeline had invited me to as a thank you for how well the case had gone. His name was Thaddeus Okafor, an urban planner who spent his career advocating for exactly the kind of housing security I had almost lost without ever seeing it coming. We talked for nearly 2 hours that first evening, not about suitcases or lawsuits, but about the buildings we loved, the neighborhoods we hoped to help rebuild, and why a home should always feel like safety, never leverage. He never once asked what my house was worth. He asked what it felt like to walk through the front door. Over the months that followed, Thaddeus and I spent long weekends walking through neighborhoods together, him pointing out zoning quirks and housing history, me noticing load-bearing walls and foundation quality out of old habit. He met my sister and my closest friends, and at no point did he ever suggest that generosity meant erasing someone else's boundaries. When his own younger sister went through a rough financial patch, he helped her find a short-term rental nearby and drove her to apartment viewings on weekends, but it never once occurred to him to hand her a key to my house, or his own, without asking me first. Watching that quiet, ordinary respect play out in real time taught me more about what healthy family loyalty actually looks like than a decade of Sunday dinners with the